The concept of the drift took the baseball world by storm around 2019 to 2020. While it may not have been a super new idea to start your momentum towards the plate, the drift became the term that everyone used to describe this action. The idea of the drift completely makes sense, but the problem is a lot of pitchers get a misconception of what the drift is actually supposed to look like. I have found that pitchers that have misconceptions about what the drift is supposed to look like end up having major issues down the chain, specifically in their lead leg block. If you don't know me yet, my name is Carter Endisch. I'm a Doctor of Physical Therapy student and current pitcher at Lewis University, and I've helped pitchers gain up to 12 miles per hour in 6 months with my training, on top of guys like Ben who went from 88 to 94 miles per hour in just 3 months. To preface everything that I'm talking about in this video, the concept of the drift is absolutely correct when done properly. I'm not by any means telling you that the drift is incorrect. All that I'm saying is that there's a lot of misconceptions about how big or how early the drift needs to happen. I think a big mistake with the drift is that pitchers actually think about the drift. More often than not, pitchers will actually drift enough on their own naturally without even needing to think about anything. First, let me give my opinion on what the drift should look like. I'm sure you'll be shocked with my answer if you watch the rest of my content, but it really does depend on the individual. There is a range that I prefer my pitchers to be in, but it's less of a number range and more of just a visual range. Some pitchers will be able to drift pretty far down the mound and still be able to get into their proper positions, but other pitchers, if they tried to go to the same distance, it would not work at all for them. In my opinion, the best drift moves are patient and subtle. I will explain why I use the words patient and subtle in the drift, but really, the drift just can't be too early or too aggressive. A big thing that affects the distance and quality of a drift is how early it happens, because the earlier that you start that drift is going to be the greater amount of distance that you cover. Again, the only issue that I have with the drift concept is that people hear about it and think that they automatically need to shift their hips forward really aggressively. With guys that think that they need a super aggressive drift away from the mound, a lot of the times they'll just end up tipping their hips upwards. Since they're trying to separate their hips from the rubber, they essentially push the back hip towards the plate, which leads that front hip to tip up into the air, and suddenly they're in this really awful position. If you start the drift too early, you're either going to have to rush the rest of your delivery to try to catch up, or you're going to end up really far down the mound. The back leg loses all the ability to hold tension, the front leg is just awkwardly in the air with the hips tipped up, and there's also basically no way for you to ride down the slope from here. It's not even typically about weakness either. It's when you start with this aggressive move down the mound, and then suddenly your center of gravity is just so far down the mound that everything's right on top of your lead leg. It's not even about weakness in this case, it's really just that aggressive first move that puts your center of gravity so far down the mound too early. Just immediately shoving your hips forward gives your lead leg no chance to ever make it out in front to block, so instead you end up with a lead leg that looks like this. The landing is really soft, the knee leaks over the foot so the forces aren't being redirected properly, and you'll have a tough time trying to stop your entire body from continuing to leak forward. This all starts from that initial move being too aggressive and too early. On the flip side, however, this is why a proper drift is really important, because if you're too far over the rubber, it's the opposite effect. Here's a few tips to make sure that your drift isn't too excessive. The first tip that I would have is to make sure that your feet aren't too far spread apart. If your feet are really far spread apart in your setup, the second that you lift your leg there, you're already really aggressively drifted forwards. You need to be careful with how far down the mound you actually set up, because you're going to be really early or really aggressive with that drift. My second tip is going to be for guys who like to coil a lot in their delivery. Since this naturally creates the drift down the mound, starting with more of your weight back over the rubber would likely keep you more in a safe range for your drift. You can see Josh Hader here. Full speed, you may look at it and think, wow, look how far down the mound he's getting. But look at the slow-mo. You can see that he's set up his weight pretty even, maybe even a bit more on the back leg, and the back hip is basically right over his back foot. When he goes into that leg lift, yes, he coils big time, but he doesn't add more distance down the mound whatsoever until he actually gets his lead leg fully up to peak leg lift. He's super patient to get to the peak of his leg lift, and that's when he starts to gain some momentum. Notice how he didn't get too far out too early, and now he can match that slope and get into his lower half. If he made this move too early, he would have gotten way too far down the mound, especially with that coil, and he would have never had the time to sync up the rest of his throw. The third tip goes again with what I just talked about with being patient going down the mound. One drill that I love giving athletes that are either sitting too early or drifting too early is the Kikuchi drill. To perform the Kikuchi drill, go into your leg lift, and then once you get towards the top, you're going to come up onto your toes for a brief second, and then lower back down quickly and continue through your throw. This forces you to not start your move towards the plate or your hinge too early by implementing that calf raise on the rear leg. Wrapping everything up, the drift move is absolutely necessary, but it has to be done properly. Again, the two words that I really like to use to describe this is patient and subtle. And if it happens too aggressively, those hips are probably going to tip up, and again, the distance covered is going to be too great. If you need help knowing what will take your game to the next level, DM me on Instagram at endisch.performance. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next week with more content to help you grow.